国際交流基金日本研究フェローカンファレンス、新たな展開を求めて、国際日本研究の今を開催したいと思います。私は前半セッションの司会を務めてまいります。日文家のクラインスと申します。よろしくお願いいたします。まず開会にあたりまして国際交流基金の佐藤由里理事からご挨拶をいただきたいと思います。佐藤理事お願いします。
皆様こんにちは。こんにちは。国際交流基金理事の佐藤由里です。本日は国際交流基金日本研究フェローカンファレンスにようこそお集まりいただきました。このカンファレンスはですね、国際日本研究コンソーシアムと国際日本文化研究センター日文研の主催によるシンポジウムの第2部として、開催させていただくことになり、多くの参加者を得られましたことを大変ありがたくこの場をお借りして感謝を申し上げます。私ども国際交流基金 JF と日文研とはですね、昨年のカンファレンス開催を契機として今年の6月に連携協定を結びました。そしてその協定を礎として今般 JF 日文研フェローシッププログラムを日文研と一緒に新たに立ち上げることになりました。そして先月9月の1日からですね、この新しいフェローシップを募集を始めています。この新しいプログラムはポストドクトラル、ポスドク研究者を対象にして、日本研究者を日本に招聘するというものです。招聘された研究者はこの日文研でご自身の研究を深めるだけでなく、研究会など運営管理業務にもですね、プログラム、プロジェクトファシリテーターとして関わっていただくと。そして内外の研究者、関係者とネットワークを広げていただくということを目的にしています。JF としましては、従来より行っております、この国際交流基金日本研究フェローシッププログラムと、それからこの新しいポストプログラム、両方合わせてですね、これからも海外の日本研究者の皆様を日本にお呼びして、日本で研究を深めていただく、そういう機会を提供していきたいと考えておりますので、本日ここにいらっしゃる皆様、それからオンライン配信をご覧の皆様におかれましては、ぜひともこうしたプログラムに関心を持っていただいてですね、お近く周りの研究者にお声掛けをお願いできればありがたく思います。私ども JF がこれから目指す方向性は、本日のカンファレンスのテーマ、新たな展開を求めて国際日本研究の今に反映されています。JF が世界中からお呼びしている日本研究フェローからの発表をお聞きいただいて、日本研究の国際的な広がりと、それからスピード感を体感していただければと思います。また、セッションとセッションの間にの時間帯にですね、フェローを中心として本日の来場の皆様全員による JF Meet JF Fellowsという新しいネットワーキングの機会を設けておりますので、研究テーマとか専門分野を超えた意見交換を通じて親交を深めていただければ幸いです。本日の各セッションにおいてフェローが登壇するときにですね、それぞれのフェローを担当する JF のスタッフからフェローを紹介させていただきます。JF スタッフのフェローに対する熱い思いも合わせて感じ取っていただければと思っております。それでは皆様どうぞ最後までお楽しみください。ありがとうございます。
佐藤先生、海外日本研究者の支援プログラム、そして本日のシンポジアムについてのご ご説明ありがとうございました。続いて、国際日本文化研究センターの松田俊彦副所長からご挨拶があります。松田先生、お願いします。
皆さん、こんにちは。日文研の松田です。先ほど、佐藤理事から、お話がありました、JF 日文研フェローシップとともに、日文研では、この度もう一つ、世界的に若手研究者を支援しようというプログラムを始めることになりました。そのことについてちょっとだけお話をさせてください。日文研では新しく日文研学術奨励賞という賞を作ることになりました。これは海外で研究をしている、国際的視野に立つ優れた研究をしている研究者、特に博士後期課程の学生さんを考えておりますが、そういう方たちに向けて賞を差し上げようというものです。で、年間3名程度を考えています。で、この賞の大事なところは、賞状がもらえるというところではなくて、実は副賞の方が大事でありまして、賞をもらった方は、3ヶ月、90日以内、日文研に滞在して研究ができるという特典が与えられます。渡航費や宿泊費は日文研持ちで、また図書館なども自由に使うことができます。推薦できるのは、午前中にお話のありました、国際日本研究コンソーシアムの、海外会員機関の方、それから日文研が、学術交流協定を結んでいる機関、それぞれの長の方から、ご推薦いただくということになります。そういう形で、日文研学術奨励賞を、若手の研究者がもらえれば励みになりますし、また研究者としてスタートラインに立つという方々が、この日文研で、集中して、日本研究をできるというまたとない、経験を得られると思います。で、すでに、募集は始まっておりまして、12月1日が締め切りになっております。この場あるいはオンラインで、コンソーシアムの海外機関の方も、お話を聞かれていることと思いますが、どうぞご推薦の方いただけましたらと思います。よろしくお願いします。以上です。
松田先生、ありがとうございます。日文研国際奨励賞にぜひいろいろとご応募いただければと楽しみに待っております。で、早速セッションに入りたいと思います。一応日本語と英語両方使うことになります。So we will start the first section, which is the Japan Foundation Fellow Conference, Exploring a New Frontier, Global Japanese Studies Today, and we'll switch between Japanese and English, whichever is comfortable for you. それではまずこの進行についてジャパンファウンデーションの大竹さんがもう少し説明をしていただくと思います。大竹さん、どうぞ。
ただいまご紹介に預かりました国際交流基金の大竹です。改めまして本日は皆様ご来訪くださり誠にありがとうございます。最初に第2部となります国際交流基金日本研究フェローカンファレンス全体の流れについて簡単ではございますが私からご案内させていただきます。プログラムに記載のあります通り、本カンファレンスは前半後半の2つのセッションに分かれており、前半の司会をクレインス先生、後半の司会を荒木先生にお願いしております。流れとしましては、まず発表フェローの発表の前に、基金の担当スタッフからフェローの紹介をさせていただきます。続きまして、フェローの研究テーマに関する発表、 コメンテーターの先生方からのコメントと順次進めさせていただきます。会場フロアからのご質問につきましては、前半後半各セッションの最後にまとめてお取りいたします。残念ながらオンラインでのご質問は第2部は対応しておりませんので、あらかじめご了承ください。なお、会場にてご参加の皆様の交流の一助となればと思い、本日お配りした資料の中に国際交流基金フェローのプロフィールシートを閉じ込んであります。今セッションの最後にもこちらの用途については改めてご案内申し上げますが、本日ご来訪の皆様につきましては、ぜひとも国際交流基金フェローに関心をご寄せいただけましたら幸いです。
大竹さん、ありがとうございました。そしたら、Let's start with the first session。ですね、2人ずつ壇上に上がるということですので、まずウェイさんとボラディスキーさん、そしてコメンテーターの片岡准教授、壇上に上がっていただければと思います。どうぞ前の方に。本日の最初の発表者はウェイランさんです。担当者、JF の担当者は金子さんです。まず金子さんからご紹介をお願いします。
はい、国際交流基金日本研究部の金子と申します。本カンファレンスの登壇者のトップバッターであるウェイランさんについて私からご紹介をさせていただきます。ウェイさんは現在アメリカワシントン大学セントルイスの博士課程に在籍され、そして、日本では関西大学にて訪日研究に取り組まれています。今回は都市の終焉をめぐって大阪漫画と映画における釜ヶ崎の表彰という題でご報告をされます。ウェイさんが大阪と出会ったのは修士時代に大阪大学へ留学された時でありました。大阪の賑やかで人情味あふれる雰囲気に魅了されると同時に、大阪大学で受講した日本文学における大阪という授業で、大阪の持つ雰囲気が歴史的に形成されたものであることを学ばれました。以後、アメリカの大学院へご進学された後に、研究テーマを大阪文学に据え、本格的に研究を始められました。ご本人曰く、大阪とは運命の出会いを果たしたとのことです。そんなウェイさんは大阪に、近代国家につきまとう社会や文化の統一化とは異なるローカルな文脈に根ざした多様性と包摂性を見出します。国内外からの移住者や在日コリアンといった人々にとって大阪はいかなる空間なのか、またそうした大阪の特徴は文学にいかに表現されているのか、ウェイさんのご発表を通してお好み焼きですとかアメちゃん、阪神タイガース、道頓堀川に飛び込むなどといったステレオタイプではない大阪の魅力と皆さんも出会えることと思います。それではウェイさん、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
金子さん、ありがとうございました。これから発表させていただきます。英語で。Hello everybody, thanks for being here. So today I will present on constructing the urban margins, representations of Kamagasaki in modern and contemporary Japanese manga and cinema. Speaking of the urban margins, what would you think of? A dangerous world, slums, gangsters, or trash mountain? The term urban margins is often used spatially to describe areas on the edge of the urban, but it is also used conceptually to describe people or places that are marginalized. So what is everyday life like on the urban margins? In this talk, by focusing on the representation of the body, I will examine two works that feature Kamagasaki, Japan's largest day labor area, from the 1980 to 2017. These works are Arimura Sen's manga series Kamayang Slum District Comic Diaries and Sato Leo's film The Kamagasaki Conjun War. They focus on the daily lives in Kamagasaki, a precarious and marginalized space in Osaka, which has often been considered as degenerated and dangerous. These two case studies are also part of my second project in progress, Constructing the Urban Margins, Poverty, Alienation, and the Resistance in Contemporary Japan. My first project, which is also my dissertation, challenges the recurring model of center and periphery that appears in the studies of Japanese literature, which locates Tokyo at the overriding center of state sovereignty. Instead, I examine how writers who are either natives of or migrants to Osaka represent the underclass and working class neighborhoods from the 1920s to the 1970s. So why do I choose these two works? The first volume of the manga series is set between 1981 and 1986, a time of high economic growth and prosperity in Japan, before the economic bubble collapsed. However, in the same time, the film confronts the urgent fact of urban gentrification and the shrinking living space of local people in Kamagasaki during an age of neoliberalism, when the logic of the free market has led to an overemphasis on individual entrepreneurship and self-responsibility over social equality and social justice. These two works are also created from the insider view of the community, as both of the author and the artist have lived in Kamagasaki for a long time. I want to briefly say a bit about why I got interested in researching these two works. So I was firstly interested in the film, The Kamagasaki Conjun War. Somebody introduced me to Sato Leo, the director. So he invited me to the soup kitchen Takedashi in Kamagasaki. So I've been going there since this March. So going there frequently have made me realize that my presumptions and also stereotypes of Kamagasaki is wrong. So the field trip and interaction with local people in Kamagasaki has deepened my understanding of the place. So I want to briefly introduce where this place is. We don't have a laser pointer here, but if you can say, if you can see the Tennoji part, which is above the south of this map, here is Nishinari. So there are also, since the 1960s, several riots between the local residents and the police have broken out in Kamagasaki for many reasons over issues ranging from hostile work conditions to unfair treatment by police. Today, Kamagasaki has also become a favorite place for foreign tourists due to its cheap lodging prices and adjacency to Dotonbori and Namba, Osaka's most popular entertainment districts. Numerous immigrants from China, Vietnam, South Asia have also moved to Kamagasaki and the Nishinari district. Here are some pictures of Kamagasaki. This is where the soup kitchen is, the Sankaku Park. And this is the streets. So these are pictures from a photographer, Nakajima Satoshi. So here are the places where the day laborers, Lodosha, live. So they are often very small, around Nijo tatami wise. So in addition to these two works that I will introduce today, there are also other works about Kamagasaki, such as Osaka writer Takeda Rintaro's novella Kamagasaki, Oshima Nagisa's film Taiyo no Hakaba, The Sun's Burial, and another pink film, Confidential Report Sex Market by Tanaka Noboru. These works reveal the predicaments of people living under the shadows of a city's prosperity. They also imply the charm of Kamagasaki through its possibilities of liberation and the spark of humanity in the local people. The first work that I will look at is this Yonkoma manga, 4-panel comic strip, Arimura Sen's Kamayang Slum District Comic Diaries. The manga depicts Alimula's observations of the day laborers he interacted with while working at the Nishinari Social Welfare Center. So here are some pictures of Alimula's Genko. Through the 4-panel comic strip, Alimula creates the optimistic, humorous, and playful character Kamayan to cheer up the hard-working laborers. The manga was first published in the Nishinari District Social Welfare Center newsletter, and later it was also serialized in the Young Comic Manga magazine from 1982 to 1986. Over the past decades, Kamayan has become a beloved, albeit fictional member of the Kamagasaki community and has received nationwide acclaim. Kamayan's image has appeared in various objects circulated within Kamagasaki, including handbooks, flyers, and packages of pocket tissue. The Kamayan stories are deeply rooted in the particular space of Kamagasaki. He is truly a character that is created out of the local and for the local. In addition to these human characters, Kamayan is often accompanied by a white dog named Kamawan. So that is Yuisu no Kazoku, Kamayan's best friend, who serves as the tsukomi, street man in their comic dialogue Manzai, to point out the funny or wrong things that Kamayan has done. The manga also introduces many other characters, including policemen, gangsters, and social workers and other day laborers. In an essay, Alimula also describes the culture of Kamagasaki as, quote, a unique spiritual island where optimism and anarchism coexist and the anti-power consciousness is strong. Quote, in this statement, Alimula suggests that the physical body both remains the only capital for this underclass and working class people, and it becomes the terrain in which these people negotiate the oppressive power of capitalism. Here are pictures of Alimula drawing the manga. And this is a Nishinari Social Welfare Center newsletter. So the first example that I want to show you is the manga Body is Capital, Karada ga Shihon. Alimula tells the story of a day laborer who accidentally had one of his fingers cut off 3 years earlier while at work, see panel 1, and received 1 million yen from insurance. In the third panel, after hearing his story, another person says, for a laborer, the body is their capital, referring to both the disempowerment and the strength of day laborers. Then the person says, yep, body is capital. See, I have 9 fingers left, so I have 9 million yen left. In portraying how the person who lost a finger takes the words of the other person literally and voluntarily commodifies his own body, apparently adhering to the logic of capitalism. Alimula manifests how the people of the underclass use humor as a weapon to speak for themselves and criticizes capitalist exploitation. Another story that stresses the alienation that Kamayan feels towards the outcome of his own work and how much he values dignity and respect is Teary Confession, Namida no Utai. A policeman tries to send away Kamayan, who is sleeping under a bridge, and calls him, quote, trash of the street, quote. Kamayan cries with sadness and anger, telling the policeman how hard he has worked on the construction of the bridge. Kamayan's best friend, agrees with Kamayan and scolds the policeman. Yep, you need to thank Kamayan. Then the policeman kneels down on the ground and says, thank you for your hard work. Kamayan stops crying and seems flattered. You may withdraw now. In the manga, Alimula reveals how the day laborers are disposed of by industrialism and the city once they become useless. They experience alienation constantly from their own work as they have been considered as cogs within the industrial machinery, instead of being respected as individual human beings. Simultaneously, Alimula emphasizes how much these people value their dignity and how hard it is to find a safe place which they can take shelter in within the cities that they have worked so hard for. Another example that I will discuss here is the Sato Leo's 16mm film, The Kamagasaki Kanjun War, Tsukiyo no Kamagassen. The film features a local war about a stolen kanjun and represents a community of orphans, sex workers, and gangsters in Kamagasaki. The kanjun is a treasure of the local yakuza, and it is essential for the succession ritual. The boss of the yakuza is going to pass this kanjun to his son Tamao, who just gets out of prison. In addition to the fight over the kanjun, another storyline is the Osaka government's aim to clean Kamagasaki by evicting the local residents, many of whom are unhoused people. Therefore, the yakuza's fight for the stolen pot overlaps with Kamagasaki people's fight for their homeland against the Osaka police. Kama also means pot in Japanese. Kamagasaki is where day laborers wait for work opportunities in the daytime and return to rest at night. In this light, Kamagasaki also functions as a big pot, which feeds and supports the living of numerous people. In recent years, under the name of creating a safe neighborhood through urban renewal and land redevelopment, the Osaka government puts surveillance cameras in Kamagasaki and forcibly moves unhoused people from the streets. Sato Leo uses the stolen kanjun as a metaphor to evoke the shrinking living space of the local people and the saddening reality of Kamagasaki's gentrification. In the beginning of the film, two men come to the soup kitchen and discover that there is no food left. The film shows their disappointed faces, which are accompanied by the sound of their stomach growling. In this film, a bodily reaction that Sato shows very often is hunger. The sound of the empty stomach also appears when the orphan Kantaro craves for another character, Nikichi's sushi. In the last scene of the film, when the female protagonist, Mei, and the orphan Kantaro climb out of the pot, the audience hears the sound of Mei's empty stomach. The film constantly implies that hunger is an important issue in the story and an inseparable part of the precarious life in Kamagasaki. For Kamagasaki residents, fulfilling their empty stomach, in other words, surviving, is their motivation to protest. The local residents' hunger for food overlaps with their strong desire for a life with justice and dignity. As the open caption imply, being in a condition of repressed angst, the residents are characterized by their autonomy, camaraderie, and periodical rights. The two examples suggest that body has often been an important theme in these works about Kamagasaki. As a marginalized entity within the communal space of Osaka, Kamagasaki has been excluded from the communal body of Osaka due to its ostensible degeneration and grotesquerie. The systemic discrimination and institutional violence afflicted on the people in Kamagasaki are latent in their bodies. Simultaneously, the body often remains the only capital for this underclass and working class people. It has also become a political battlefield in which they negotiate powers of exploitation and control and to fight for their subjectivity, dignity, and belonging. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。釜ヶ崎に住む人々の表彰、そして身体との関係について非常に分かりやすく説明いただきました。これについて、日文系の片岡前准教授がコメントします。片岡先生は近現代文学、そして比較文学を専門としておりまして、特に日本の近現代文学が英訳されて海外で出版されてどのように受容されたかについて研究を行っています。それでは片岡先生お願いします。
クレイ先生ありがとうございます。 ウェイさんも素晴らしい発表をありがとうございます。So I specialize in modern Japanese literature and translation, so I'm not that much familiar with manga or film, but there was so much to learn from your presentation today. So I didn't know much about Kamagasaki before, and I got to know about the place quite recently through Nakazawa Shinichi's The Osaka as Diver. Have you ever read it before? Yeah, so just to briefly explain what the book is like. So in one of the chapters in the book, Nakazawa takes the readers through layers of history of Kamagasaki, various memories attached to the place, and explains how its unique geographical space formed the particular characteristic of Kamagasaki and how it has functioned as identiki, jioki, so as a utsuwa or container that willingly accept and welcome proletariats. And I guess that description exactly matches with the image of the port that appears in the film, I thought. And the urban space of Osaka, especially in the context of literature, for me, till then was more of Osaka as a contrast to Tokyo, as typically represented in the Tanizaki's Sasameyuki. But Nakazawa's chapter on Kamagasaki and your presentation today invited me to look at different aspects of Osaka literature and other form of cultural products like films or manga and the cultural expressions as well. And I believe that your research could offer an addition to urban studies and could perhaps serve as a kind of an intersection between urban studies and literary studies or cultural, investigation of cultural products as well. But could be also a stimulus and inspiration for example, scholars specializing in spatial anthropology, a field of study advocated by Jinnai Hidenobu, who wrote the Tokyo Spatial Anthropology. And your research perhaps could also fit into the recent growing discussion about Saikaihatsu Bungaku, redevelopment literature, the concept or analytical framework put forward by Professor Watanabe at the Osaka University, who wrote Nakagami Kenjiron, which came out quite very recently. I think it was last year. And your description and representation of people in Kamagasaki and their history somehow reminded me of the Tokyo Ueno Station, written by Yumiri, as both locations experienced the same economic crisis after the bubble economic bursting, and the change of working environment of the fluid workers accompanied with the changes. But at the same time, I'm also under the impression that the depiction and illustration of those fluid workers are quite different as well. And I thought that it might be quite interesting to compare and contrast these two distinct locations within those works to highlight unique aspects of the Kamagasaki, or perhaps even the Osaka-Tokyo fluid complementary relationship, which is one of your main arguments as well. It could be a kind of support for your argument as well. And I also, you partially already touched upon this already, but I also wondered how the nature of Kamagasaki as a utsuwa or container or as a pot has changed after the Kaitai demolition took place, demolition of Yoseba, and how such a change are represented in the films or manga as well. Manga by Arimura, for example. Was it Arimura? Yeah. And so I believe it was a very big transformation because the Kamagasaki used to act as a kind of kichinyado, and then Doyagai, and then later Yoseba, but now turned into a kind of town of welfare, I believe. So, and your talk today focused on around the same period that such drastic change took place. And I've been wondering whether such a change of Kamagasaki has impact on ways in which those films or manga represented the affective bonds among people, or any other Osaka literature that you have explored so far, including the Kamagasaki, written by Takeda Rintaro. And sorry, I forgot one. And I really enjoyed your analysis on how the role of body in the as a capital in the comic, and you didn't touch upon like literature this time, but I thought that it would be quite interesting to look at how to look at the voices of the tone, or by examining the narrative techniques, for example, or tone of the voices used and the vernacular used by those local people. And the reason why I mentioned this was, for example, in the case of Maedai, he is the author of Toshikukan no Naka no Bungaku, but he did this quite fascinating analysis of Machi-no-koi voices of the tone by exploring the Shitamachi literature. So perhaps the examination of what kind of voices are used, for example, whether it's singular voice or polyphonic voices, or whether it's males or females, or it could be silence throughout. I don't know what kind of voices are employed in those films or cartoons or literature that you have examined so far, but the kind of analysis could perhaps show how the reality of everyday life in Kamagasaki are crafted in those literary works or other cultural expressions of your focus. So I'm very much looking forward to getting to know more about the details of your research in the future and charms of Osaka neighborhood literature in general. And I'm looking forward to getting to know more about the details of your research in the later Q&A discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
片岡先生、ありがとうございました。もう完璧に時間通りに言っています。次はアイダアナボラベクシーさんです。そして担当者は香西さんで、まず香西さんから紹介をお願いします。
今、オレゴン大学で、博士課程でいらっしゃいますけれども、彼女はもともとは、カザフスタンの出身でおられまして、オレゴン大学では東アジア言語文化博士課程で、今、論文執筆中でございます。で今、名古屋大学で国際交流基金のフェローとしては名古屋大学におられますけれども、実は彼女は、5年前にもやはり文科省の留学生として、その時もやはり名古屋大学で修士に在籍して修士号を取られました。でその時に名古屋大学で受け入れ教官をしていただきました岩田クリスティーナ先生が今回も博士論文の時の指導教官になっていただいたということで、いわば名古屋っていう町は彼女にとってのホームグラウンドであるということが言えるかと思います。で彼女の執筆論文の中身なんですけれども、ここでちょっとキーワードとして難しい言葉で、non-carceral confinement という言葉があって、でそのまま訳すると非監獄的、拘束監禁状態ということになりましょうか。要は、刑務所の外にいてもですね、人間が経験するような、検閲とかもしくは禁書、サーベイランスというようなものを扱っていると。サーベイランスというのは、先のコロナ禍におけるロックダウンのようなああいう状況を指しているんだと思います。で彼女はですねこういう、拘束状態というのが特に日本の平成の時代に書かれた文学、名前を出すと具体的には桐野夏生さん、田和田陽子さん、小川陽子さんと、こういった ディストピア文学ですね。そういった文学にこういった拘束状態がどのように、表彰されているかというのが研究の内容でございます。で、このディストピアな状況というのはですね、実際のところ、彼女ともちょっと話したんですけれども、あえて、ディストピア小説だけじゃなくて、もうそもそも今の世の中自体がかなりディストピア的な状況になってきて、あえて文学に求めるまでもないな、みたいな話をちょっとオリエンテーションの時に彼女と話したことがございます。で、あとちょっと違う話になりますけれども、今度彼女の出身のカザフスタンという、中央アジアの国々でございますけれども、こちらにはラグマンというですね、実はうどん、スープ入りのうどんのような、そういう食べ物があっても私も非常に好きなんですけれど、一方彼女の今研究地である名古屋においては、有名なうどんの文化がございます。で、これから今日なんか非常に暖かくてですね、皆さんの中には半袖の方もいらっしゃる、とても10月とは思えないような暖かいですけれども、これからどんどん日本も寒くなって寒い冬を迎えると。そういう寒い中でですね、このディストピアな内容の非常に暗淡たる社会を描いた論文を執筆すると、なかなか気が塞いできてですね、気がめいてくるんじゃないかと。で、日本も残念ながら以前ほど、日本の社会というのも以前ほどの勢いがなくなって、日本自体がかなり先ほど申しましたディストピアンな社会になってきているというところで研究されて、さぞ落ち込むこともあるんじゃないかと。そういう時はですね、特に寒い冬は名古屋ですから味噌煮込みうどんとかですね、あときしめんとか、そういったあったかいものを食べて、故郷のラグマンにも思いを馳せながらですね、ぜひ日本の厳しい、これから厳しくなるはずですけれども、厳しい冬を乗り切ってですね、そして論文の完成に近づけていただきたいと、そのように私は担当者として願っております。それでは以上でございますので、相永さん、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you, Kozai-san, and thanks to everyone who helped organize this wonderful event today. And actually, Wei-Ran-san's発表 is a pretty good segue into what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'd like to start my presentation with a quote from a famous novel by Kobayashi Takiji, which is renowned for its anti-capitalist sentiment, Crab Cannery Ship, written in 1929. Crab cannery ships were considered factories, not ships. Therefore, maritime law did not apply to them. Moreover, the crab cannery ships were factories, pure and simple, and yet the factory laws did not apply to them either. Consequently, no other side offered such an accommodating setting for management's freedom to act with total impunity. So what I'd like to draw your attention towards are the parts in bold. Here, Kobayashi describes a lawless gray zone outside the norms of ordinary society, which manifests in two ways. First, the management of the ship abuses the workers without the fear of any repercussions. And second, while the workers are not in an actual prison, they're still bound to the ship by their material conditions without the possibility of escape. I'm quoting this excerpt because it aptly illustrates both the type of literary setting and the form of captivity I explore in my project. My research focuses on representations of the relationship between non-carceral confinement and writing in contemporary Japanese dystopian literature. Instead of conceptualizing captivity in narrow terms as relating to only prisons, the notion of non-carceral confinement encompasses the figurative captivity outside the spaces of criminal incarceration. In other words, it is a broader term to describe non-penal situations as confining or restrictive, whether through censorship, surveillance, or physical restraint, as for example in the Kobayashi excerpt I just cited earlier. These are the 4 novels I work on in my project. The first one is The Memory Police by Ogawa Yoko. The next one is Polar Disease by Yoshimura Mainichi. Then there's The Emissary by Tawada Yoko, and Nichibotsu or The Dusk by Kirino Natsuo. The selection, as mentioned by Kozai-san, roughly corresponds to the post-bubble tumultuous Heisei era that was marked by a series of profound socio-political, economic, cultural, and environmental crises. And I'll return to the justification behind this selection a bit later. But for now, I'd like to say that the stories are similar in that they each center around depictions of struggles of writer protagonists navigating both physical and metaphorical forms of captivity. On a physical level, the fictional worlds are set in closed-off, inescapable spaces, such as sanatorium, village, town, or nation. On a metaphorical level, censorship is imagined as having not only textual, but also material effects, which manifest through the body. For instance, somatic descriptions of discomfort, muteness, or even more allegorically, amputation of body parts. In other words, we could see how in this text, compromised bodily autonomy mirrors how censorship compromises freedom of expression. Before going any further, I'd like to take a moment to map out working definitions of the other two key terms in the title of my project, law and literature. Broadly speaking, law is a body of norms and regulations regarding external human conduct and decorum established by the governing authority and having a binding legal effect. Literature, on the other hand, is famously more elusive and harder to define, for it encompasses various types of texts on any number of themes. But in my dissertation, I refer to writing to emphasize the process of the literary creation itself. This approach is driven by the fact that in the novels under the consideration, we see that the writer protagonists often describe their own kind of difficulties of penning their own literary projects. Moreover, as literary critic Terry Eagleton poignantly observes, literature may be at least as much of a question of what people do to writing as of what writing does to them. In other words, writing is not a neutral or static, but a transformative process. Although literature and law belong to different and seemingly unrelated domains of human activity and experience, there are significant ways in which they are intertwined, as they are both rhetorical disciplines. We can see it in the way that legal writings are infiltrated with literary forms such as narrative and metaphor, and the fact that laws necessitate interpretation. Furthermore, literature often addresses or even criticizes the problems of law and justice, as for example in the literary and theoretical work by Natsume Soseki. According to Michael Bordash, Soseki's oeuvre could be understood as questioning the radical changes brought by Meiji-era private property law, which not only brought Japan on par with other modern empires, but also had catastrophic effects for ordinary people. Without going into too much detail, what's fascinating about this is the fact that private property law would be actually further redoubled and protected by yet another law, Peace Preservation Law of 1925, which served as a foundation for the thought control apparatus of Imperial Japan. But now I'd like to actually segue into my own research question. In my research, I look at how novels represent the material effects of law on writing as both norms and censorship, whether through practices of written repentance, institutional confinement, or obsolescence of novels. I pursue the following questions. If writing is a transformative process that affects both the text and the author, as all these works seem to imply, then what kind of subject is created through writing produced under duress? How can we think beyond the dichotomy of collaboration and resistance? And finally, what insights can be produced about the thorny question of literature's role in contemporary moment? My preliminary and highly speculative answer is that first, through these works, we can explore the dialectical relationship between literature and law, which is not of pure opposition, but more ambiguous at its core. So we can think, for example, about how in The Memory Police, it is arguably the editor R who has more authority over the protagonist's literary output than the government through his personal relationship with her. In other words, the novel complicates our understanding of censorship as something that is simply imposed from above to down. And then second, each novel negotiates a different type of relationship to law, defiance, collaboration, horror at the ambiguity of law, or living with the status quo. However, the stories do not simply reject institutional deliberation, but rather lament the very absence of the law as restoring order and protecting the rights and dignity of the people. As I mentioned earlier, these are post-bubble era novels. So the reason for that is twofold. So first, it allows us to trace how depictions of confinement in Japanese literature have shifted within a specific period of time, in this case from the 1990s onwards. So we can think, for example, about how different are the worlds of the 1994 novel The Memory Police in comparison to the 2020 novel Nichibotsu. If the former one is more dream and vague and dreamlike, then the latter one is highly political, extremely grim, and overly realistic. I'd like to mention, however, that I'm still looking for another novel to add from the 1990s in order to strengthen this comparative aspect in my work. And second point related to the first one is I want to trace how the post-bubble crisis of capitalism affected literary production in Japan. As Jay Rubin reminds us in his investigation of the historical developments of censorship system in Japan, the pressures of censorship arise from the practical problems characteristic of the periods of crisis and change. According to Jay Rubin, literature only gets banned when it is considered to be dangerously subversive to the dominant regime. My methodology is informed by various strands of philosophical and theoretical works, ranging from works on sovereign power, for example, Giorgio Agamben's work on state of exception and memory studies, to theories of the novel, such as Atsuko Ueda's Concealment of Politics, about the creation of literature as a cultural category in Meiji Japan. I take this approach to not only situate the works within their own cultural and historical context, but also to elaborate on larger universal themes at play here. Moreover, to aid my theorization of the topos of confinement in Japanese literary context, I turn to prominent scholar of carceral literature, Monika Fludernik, who wrote a monograph, Metaphors of Confinement, The Prison in Fact, Fiction and Reality in 2019, which traces not only the historical developments in depictions of imprisonment in the Western literary canon, but also questions the role and importance of captivity in our cultural imagination and worldview today. My overall goal with this project is to conceptualize the topos of confinement in contemporary Japanese literary context. To my knowledge, current Anglophone scholarship on the relationship between incarceration and writing is limited to the investigations of historical phenomena of forced ideological conversion, or tenko, and Japanese prisoner of war experiences in Siberia. I suggest that we can also read these novels as representing the literary counterpart to the pessimistic cinematic trope Inescapable Japan, identified by film scholar Aaron Giroux. It refers to films that portray a Japan from which it is virtually impossible to escape by depicting vain attempts at leaving the nation. From characters fleeing to the beaches and shores, even perishing there, to those leading liminal existence on the border. I think that especially within the post-3/11 context, it makes sense to read these novels in this angle, since we've seen how some of the filmic and prose texts also grapple with the inescapability of radiation and the futility of relocation within Japan. Finally, during the 5 months of fellowship, I will be primarily focusing on immersing myself in Japanese resources, which ranges from databases, periodicals, literary reviews, etc., archival research on Tenko literature and reading additional novels as possible source materials. For instance, right now I'm reading Ito Seiko's I Condone the Banning of the Novels, or Shousetsu Kinshirei ni Sandou Suru. And finally, I will also be writing my actually first chapter of my dissertation, which I will complete back in the US. And this is actually all from me. Thank you so much.
アイダーナさんありがとうございます。バブル崩壊後のディストピアン文学というジャンルの中の4つの小説の中で、法と文学との関係、そして監禁の概念化についてかなり深く掘り下げていることを分かりました。これについても片岡先生、コメントをお願いします。
クリスです。ありがとうございます。アダムさん、ありがとうございました。So, thank you so much for sharing your very fascinating research project. So, the focus of your presentation was on the contemporary Japanese dystopian literature, but many of the elements somehow reminded me of Fahrenheit 451. Have you ever? I would strongly recommend to read it. So it's a story of a society where books have been banned, and these like firemen burned those banned books. But maybe you have. Yeah, so both Fahrenheit and some of the novels of your focus involve quite common elements such as books, book writings, and censorship, memory, the element of surveillance, of course, and they also talk about shometsu, the disappearance of punishings as well. But it's quite interesting to see also that the ways in which their struggles are illustrated are strikingly different. And speaking of ways in which the element of surveillance, one of the key elements that you mentioned in exploring the non-carceral confinement, I've been wondering if there is any cultural difference, if there are any cultural differences in terms of depicting this element, and if so, how the elements manifest themselves in those texts. And this invites us to the question of how such differences are narrated and illustrated. For example, a sociologist called David Leon, for example, argues that the cultures of surveillance develop differently depending on their political economies and post-authoritarian or colonial past. It's quite an interesting statement. And such differences in terms of how these novels represent the surveillance might impact global circulation of the text also might be quite interesting question to explore from my perspective as a researcher focusing on transition. And this point leads me to another question, that is the reception of those texts outside of Japan. Because if I remember correctly, the Ogawa Yoko's The Memory Police has been nominated to the Booker Prize and also for the National Book Award, NBA, as well. And The Emissary by Tawada Yoko won the NBA, I think, quite recently. And I haven't had a chance to look into those book reviews for the English editions myself yet, but I'm quite interested to know how the English readers react to ways in which the non-carceral confinement is illustrated in those texts, if they see any cultural differences, or if such illustrations are crafted in a way that communicable to any readers who are not familiar with the Japanese dystopian literature. And I'm particularly interested in the case of Ogawa's The Memory Police. As the text shows, the author's keen interest in the diary of Anne Frank, or what's so-called diary of a young girl in its English version. It shows many of the scenes evoke us this work, I think. And as you probably well know, she published a collection of essays on Franco no Kyoku a year after she published The Memory Police. So I thought if such on Frank's context was at work in this memory police in any way, I'll be quite interested to know how these association might impact the reception of the text in other parts of the world. So I should probably now end my comment here, and rather it was a series of questions, but that shows your presentation invited me to see so many different side of things that I didn't even imagine. So thank you so much for sharing your research findings. I'm very much looking forward to reading your thesis at some point, in the future. Thank you.
Kataoka Sensei, thank you very much for your comments and concrete examples. If you have questions, we have a Q&A section afterwards, so please ask them. We have our next speaker, so first a warm applause for the present speakers. So next to come to the floor is Gareth Grusbeck and Marco Deldin. And Yamada Sensei and Kamoto Sensei もこちらへどうぞ。よろしくお願いいたします。それでは早速第2セッションに入りたいと思います。まずはガレッツ・グルーズベックさんで、JF の担当者佐藤さんです。佐藤さんお願いします。
日本研究部の佐藤と申します。私からグロスベック・ギャレットさんのご紹介をさせていただきます。ギャレットさんのご専門は民族音楽学で、アメリカウェズリーアン大学博士課程に在籍され、現在は東京芸術大学にてアニメ音楽から見た日本音楽とは何かというテーマで研究をされています。音楽が好きだったおじい様の影響もあり、ご自身も子供の頃からピアノやハープ、バイオリンを習っていたそうで、当時アメリカではファイナルファンタジーやポケモンが大流行していて、ピアノでそのテーマソングを演奏できたギャレットさんは一躍クラスの人気者だったとか。高校留学で初めて訪れた日本では、ホストファミリーがチェロ奏者だったりと音楽に深い縁のあるギャレットさんですが、大学卒業後はジェットプログラムで、鳥取県に住んだ後に名古屋音楽大学で修士号を取得されました。私も愛知県出身ですので、愛知多いですね。愛知県出身ですので、名古屋飯トークで盛り上がり、ちなみにギャレットさんの一押し名古屋飯は手羽先だそうです。ギャレットさんは日本研究者である傍ら、ご自身も日本の、伝統和楽器の一つである琴の演奏家としてもご活躍されています。最近では和楽器の作り手が少なくなっているのに加えてコロナの影響もあって、歴史のある和楽器屋さんが廃業に追いやられたりと厳しい状況があるそうで、若い世代に和楽器、邦楽の楽しさ、面白さを伝えたいと思い、日々研究に励まれています。では、そんな音楽に情熱を注ぐギャレットさんの発表をどうぞお聞きください。
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to all the organizers today and the commentators. We really appreciate it. This is a wonderful opportunity as Japan Foundation Fellows. So my presentation will be about music, but I won't be playing any music today. We're streaming on YouTube, and as you know, YouTube will cut the audio of any copyrighted popular music that plays. So please, I encourage you to later go ahead and listen to some of the music I'll talk about. In spring of this year, I find myself once again in the karaoke room at Anime Boston, a large anime convention attended by over 20,000 fans annually. As moderators of the karaoke organized signups, event-goers, most of them in colorful costumes and wigs, climb onto the short conference room stage and take the microphone. One screen faces the audience while another faces the performers, allowing them to read the lyrics of the karaoke tracks or music videos played from YouTube. Aside from a handful of exceptions, the participants predominantly sing in Japanese, drawing from a wide range of music featured in anime and video games. The selections also heavily feature songs created for Vocaloid virtual singers using artificial human voice software pioneered by music giant Yamaha. Japan has really offered a lot of music technology to the world. In his 1999 ethnographic exploration of music corporate culture, Keith Negus writes the following. I'll give you a moment to look at that. In the streaming era, this process of knowledge production has in large part shifted to the arena of music recommendation algorithms, which introduce songs to listeners based on assumed listening preferences, particularly about musical style. I argue that anime music, a term used widely in Anglophone discourse to refer to a broad, heterogeneous collection of musical materials, points to limitations in the corporate understandings about musical taste and consumer behavior that underlie currently dominant distribution models such as Spotify. What is it about the music featured at Anime Boston's karaoke event that makes it so compelling for North American fans to memorize, learn, and perform in front of audiences, even if they don't speak Japanese? Recently, colleagues and friends in both Japan and the US have noted the disparity between the popularity of K-pop and J-pop. I argue that, in fact, J-pop and J-rock and other Japanese genres do have significant global audiences. They are simply more likely to be categorized as anime music or occasionally as city pop. Furthermore, as a crucial part of the audiovisual medium that is anime, I argue that music's role has been heretofore largely neglected in scholarship, which has instead tended to focus on narrative or visual analysis, perhaps reflecting the hegemony of the visual, long critiqued in Euro-American scholarship. The relationship between cultural production and listening practice is ever more important to consider since the advent of music streaming platforms. In the era of atomized individual listening through headphones, computer scientists have poured increasingly extensive efforts into parsing musical texture in an effort to capture and maintain listener attention. Nolan Gasser, one of the chief architects of early music recommendation platform Pandora Radio, frames his analysis of musical taste in intriguingly genetic terms, referring to the pop genotype, rock genotype, or classical genotype. These categorizations are based on qualities such as instrumentation, beats per minute, tempo, vocal range, etc. I'm particularly intrigued by the way that this taxonomic, quasi-biological understanding of musical taste has influenced fields such as music cognition and psychology, as well as computer analysis and machine learning. In a recent publication, drawing from music psychology researchers, Berklee College of Music professor Susan Rogers and neuroscientist Ogi Ogas argue for a biological aesthetic model. And I'll again give you a moment to read that. This approach to genre stands in contrast to the work of scholars in music, anthropology, and sociology, who for decades have called for greater attention to musical genres' close relationship with class, race, age, and cultural background. Far from coherent categories, musical genres are the site of social contestation. This is perhaps most evident in the North American context through the example of country music. Nadine Hubbs, musicologist Nadine Hubbs, has highlighted the ways in which American undergraduate students often specifically point out that they will listen to, quote, anything but country, end quote. This is far more than a simple matter of musical taste. It carries political and class connotations. Furthermore, failure to conform to proper modes of gender expression expected of singers marked with the country label can be a fraught endeavor, especially for transgender musicians. This leads many, according to musicologist Shayna Golden-Perschebacher, to label themselves instead as Americana or folk performers, even though the musical material itself is largely indistinguishable from country music. As a theoretical approach that inherently resists the reification of dominant paradigms, queer theory provides the opportunities to consider the ways in which anime music subverts expectations and breaks normative listening patterns. The work of Sherry Tucker demonstrates the ways in which queer theory can illuminate power structures at play in the frequent framing of jazz, another genre with blurry boundaries, as heteronormative and mainstream. She provocatively asks, when did jazz go straight? Pointing to jazz's long history as a subaltern genre pioneered by minoritized performers. Anime music has genre tendencies, to borrow the language of the queer community, but resists typical categorization along genre lines, being defined instead by its association with Japan. Queer theory's attention to outliers makes anime music a particularly salient example for examining disjunctures between scholarly and popular understandings of music under 21st century distribution models. As one example, after the 2004 release of Utada Hikaru's first English language record, poor sales prompted responses from American journalists and music critics that, as expected, it was nearly impossible for Japanese artists to be successful in North America. Music critic Steve McClure noted in the New York Times that, quote, the list of big-name Japanese artists who have tried and failed in the American market is depressingly long, end quote. And yet, less than 2 decades later, Japanese music of various types features prominently on English language streaming sites. A key knowledge gap is the way in which this music is framed by different stakeholders. Rather than J-pop, J-rock, or traditional Japanese music, it is often referred to under the umbrella category of anime music. A parallel phenomenon may perhaps be seen in the idea of city pop, which some of you may have heard of. This is bubble-era Japanese popular music that has achieved enormous popularity on YouTube thanks to recommendation algorithms. Singer Maria Takeuchi was featured in the Japan Times in 2018 after the remarkable resurgence of her track Plastic Love on YouTube, more than 30 years after its release. Here I would love to play Plastic Love, but I encourage you all to go listen later. A Japanese acquaintance recently remarked to me how the term city pop made little sense to him. He instead knew these songs as new music. Different groups often assign radically different meanings and terminologies to the same musical materials. Curiously, the idea of Japan as genre is evident in approaches to genre that otherwise focus little on concepts of nation or national identity. This study from 2016 is particularly intriguing. It analyzes a dataset of self-selected genre tags by musicians on the social media platform MySpace. This data was collected in 2007. And musicians could select up to 3 genre tags from a total list of 123. While individual performers or composers often insist that their own music transcends genre, the authors of this study note that, quote, MySpace musicians stick to a relatively small and recurrent subset of these possibilities, which they combine in highly regular and patterned ways, end quote. The authors mention it only briefly, but anyone who is familiar with the historically segregated nature, racially segregated nature of the North American popular music industry will, of course, note those influences on the way that the data is laid out here. It is clear that Japanese or Japan are major keywords as well, though the authors of the study do not, in the text, explicitly refer to Japan as a major concept. Japanese, Japan, or J-pop appear in all 4 graphs in the paper, alongside only a tiny handful of other country or regional signifiers. My Japan Foundation Research Fellowship will allow me to conduct extensive ethnographic research with composers of anime background music. I will also be able to conduct research at events aimed at marketing Japanese popular music to foreign audiences. Through these research activities, I aim to better understand how the creators of anime music understand their role in the production of this transnational category. Furthermore, as a specialist in Japanese traditional music and performer of the koto, I aim to interrogate the relationship between other ostensibly national Japanese genres, such as the music of kabuki theater or taiko drumming, and anime music. Do the creators of this music consider it to be Japanese music? How do they respond to the framing of it as such by fans overseas or by the Japanese government? How does their training at arts institutions in Japan, which are heavily steeped in the Euroclassical tradition, influence their understanding of their work? I believe the answers to these questions will help to shed greater light on issues of broad significance to scholars in fine arts and humanities, particularly considering the ways in which digital streaming models are reshaping our understanding of the relationship between cultural production and geopolitical power structures. Thank you.
Garrett-san, thank you very much. When you started talking about the anime festival, you said something about the costumes, and I had to think about the symposium this morning, because here it says what the music you love says about you, and this morning we had it about what the clothes say about you. So there is indeed a relationship between the two. もうストリーミングプラットフォームから音楽の思考、ジェンダー、アニメ音楽、邦楽、J-POP などいろいろな関係性について話していただきました。本日のコメンテーターは日文家の山田昌司教授です。山田先生は、非常に広い研究分野にいまして、情報学から文化交流史まで幅広く研究されて、著作権もやっていらっしゃいますし、日本の禅とか、ポピュラーカルチャーが海外でどのように受容されて変容されて、また日本に逆輸入されているかについて研究されています。山田先生、お願いします。
Thank you very much for your introduction, Professor Krenz. And thank you very much, Mr. Grosbeck. Actually, I'm not a musicologist, so I anticipate if I can make a good comment or not. And so I ever joined Anime Boston in 2012 while I was staying in Boston. But I have not joined the karaoke. I regret it today. So Japan's music scene is highly rich and diverse. I mean, it's a blend of both traditional sounds and contemporary beats. Mr. Grosbeck has this interesting view about it, especially after anime and video games gained global popularity through online streaming. The term Hogaku is often translated as Japanese music, I think, but it's not that straightforward. Some see it as traditional Japanese. Some see it as traditional Japanese music like koto, shamisen, shakuhachi, gagaku, and minyo. While others might include J-pop, enka, and new music. But if you've ever been to a music store in Japan, some stores keep Hogaku and J-pop separate, and others combine them. But international listeners might see all it just as Japanese music. Anime music is obviously the music you hear in anime shows, especially those catchy opening and ending themes And these tracks often need to fit the anime's vibes. And in recent cases, they are cut to precisely 89 seconds. It's the Japanese way. Anime music has evolved over time after the success of Astro Boys in the 60s. There were specialized anime singers like Mizuki Ichiro, Sasaki Isao, and Horikoshi Mitsuko. But post-2000, with the rise of voice actresses boom, we saw them singing anime tracks. Today, you've even got big name J-pop singers composing and singing anime music like RADWIMPS, Yonezu Kenshi, YOASOBI. But you still have anime-focused singers like Lisa doing great. In a nutshell, anime music has reshaped the boundary of Japanese music. With the digital era, streaming platforms now dictate our music choices, making it a complex world. That's what Mr. Groesbeck delves into. I'd like to comment on the 3 points Mr. Groesbeck has brought up on the last slide. For the first point, when you're talking about the link between anime music and what you call national Japanese genres, what exactly do you mean by national? Like I was saying earlier, the whole Hogaku thing is pretty complex. In addition, music everywhere is influenced by sounds from all over the world. Some anime music got beats from American rap music, just like Idol, the big hit in this year. Or if I pick up a rather old animation, Rengai Circulation from Bakemonogatari, they all employs rap music. And remember, Akira, the opening theme is from Bali Island's Jegoku-san. So you mentioned about queer musicians, so I reminded the Jobachi group. A group, they name themselves Jobachi. I think they are very queer group. So anime music is super interesting because it mixes so many styles regardless of where they come from. I'm gonna skip the second point. And about the last point, digital streaming, these platforms have blown the doors wide open, letting everyone, everywhere, at any time. That means these decontextualized songs can mean something different depending on where you are in the world. In addition, based on your listening history, these platforms are telling you what you want to listen to. It's like they are trapping you in a musical filter bubble. I anticipate this kind of algorithm-created perception effect creates and transforms people's recognition of the Japanese music genre. I think this point would also be worth considering in your future research. Thank you very much.
山田先生、ありがとうございました。このアニメ音楽の背景、そしてリサーチクエスチョンへのコメント、ありがとうございました。続きいきます。マルコ・デルディンさんで、担当者が松尾さんです。松尾さん、お願いします。
日本研究部の松尾でございます。よろしくお願いいたします。今日はデルジンさんのご紹介をまずさせていただきます。マルコさんはですね、イタリアのベネチア大学カ・フォスカリで学ばれまして、修士ではハイデルベルグ大学と京都大学のジョイントデグリーで国際連携文化越境を専攻されました。で、現在はダブルデグリーでベネチア大学カ・フォスカリとドイツのハイデルベルグ大学に在籍されていまして、現代日本におけるジェンダー分析を研究していらっしゃいます。 幼い頃にご両親から読書の楽しさを教わられてまして、すっかり本の虫になってしまったマルコさんです。時間さえあれば読書をしている超がつくほど真面目な6カ国語を操る学生さんに成長されまして、2019年に交換留学生として京都大学にいらっしゃいました。来日後も超真面目な生活を送っておられまして、なんと博物館では読書と同じぐらい好きな埴輪を一日中時間を忘れてめでているような、そんなマルコさんです。フェローの皆さん、埴輪ご存知ですか？素晴らしい。うなずいていらっしゃる方がたくさんいらっしゃいます。もう2000年ほど前に日本で作られた土製のすごい素朴なお人形なんですけれども、こんな超真面目なマルコさんをある日ですね、ダンスが大好きな京都大学のある友人が神宮丸太町に連れ出したのは、運命の歯車が動き出した瞬間だったのかもしれません。運命のその日、マルコさんが連れ出されたのは神宮丸太町にあるクラブメトロ。クラブではなくてクラブの方ですよね、きっとね。踊る方ですよね。はい。で、その日がたまたま月末の金曜日だったことが、マルコさんのその後の人生を一変させることになろうとは、その当時のマルコさんも思っていなかったのではないでしょうか。そのクラブメトロの月末の金曜日で行われているのが、なんとドラッグクイーン賞なんですね。ドラッグじゃないですよ。ドラッグですよ。日長に埴輪をめでているマルコさんが、超真面目なマルコさんにそれがどれほどの衝撃なことだったか、もう想像に難くないかと思います。しかしそこはこの聡明なマルコさんです。ゴージャスなドラッグたちのビジュアルの奥に潜む日本社会のアイデンティティ形成の特性と LGBTQ におけるクロスカルチャーの真相を見出し、やがてそれが彼の研究テーマに熟成していったのでした。本日はその概読をご紹介いただきます。それではマルコ・デルジンさん、発表をお願いいたします。
Hello everyone, thank you very much to Matsuo-san for this amazing introduction, and thank you to all the organizers of this amazing event. I am going to present today my PhD project that I tentatively titled Diamonds in the Subway, Analyzing Gender in Contemporary Japanese Society Through the Drag of Club Metro Kyoto, which is a mouthful and I get it, so we will just jump in and try to understand the words one by one. First of all, what is the topic of my project? As Matsuo-san has already stated, it's an analysis of the construction and perception of gender roles and gender identity in contemporary Japan, and I'm doing this through the lenses of drag. In particular, I'm doing it by analyzing the Diamonds Are Forever show. It's a drag show that is held each month, the last Friday of the month, at Club Metro, Kyoto, which is a small club located at the entrance of the Keihan Jingu Marutamachi station. And that's why there are diamonds in the subway in my title. And this whole project was started by two quotes that I'm gonna show you now. The first one is by RuPaul, who is probably the most famous drag queen at the moment, that says, "We're all born naked and the rest is drag," by which she means that we're all born naked and from the moment on we just perform identities through and throughout our whole life. And the other one is along the same lines. We're always performing identities, but when we consciously perform one and people acknowledge our performance, it's theater. And that made me think, can we draw parallelisms between the way drag queens create the drag persona and how we, even subconsciously, create our own identities, our own personas in real life, whatever real life is? And how does this construction happen, if that's the case? Where do we take the bits and pieces that we then piece together to create our own selves? And is this process a cross-cultural one? And finally, given that there is a theater element in all this, is there a spillover between the drag persona and the identity of the performer outside of drag? Through my work, I aim to unveil previously under-researched understandings of gender in contemporary Japan that contribute to overcoming the monolithic understanding of gender, in particular in contemporary society. And I also hope to create a starting point for future studies about drag in Japan, a field that is widely understudied. My hypothesis and what I expect to prove is that gender in contemporary Japan is the result of transcultural interactions occurring at 3 levels at least: between Japan and its past, between Japan and the West, and between different cultures within contemporary Japan itself. On top of this, I think that my research is relevant, in particular in the current field of gender queer studies, Japanese studies, and possibly transcultural studies, because there is no extensive academic work on drag in Japan, even though Japan has a long history of cross-dressing. Mitsuhashi even sees it starting with Yamato Takeru. And this brings us to a lack of understanding of a particularly widespread subcultural phenomenon. Despite starting in the 1980s in the Kansai area, right now drag is all over Japan. You can find shows in Tokyo, of course, Osaka, Nagoya, and I'm sure in many other cities. Drag gives us an advantage in analyzing gender because it makes the various models of narrative easier to trace. It makes it possible to clearly see the transcultural interactions at play by dissecting how the drag persona is created, and possibly helps us complicating our understanding of gender in Japan and elsewhere, I'd say. But then why not Tokyo, why not Osaka, why not Nagoya, why Club Metro specifically? And that's because it's the longest running drag show in Japan. It's the first one organized by Japanese people in 1989 in Osaka. After hopping from club to club for some years, it settled in 1991 in Kyoto. So it is really important, both for the city of Kyoto and for the drag scene in Japan in general. It has a high historical and cultural relevance, given its connections to the artistic collective Dan-type, whose member Furuhashi Teiji was one of the founders, together with Simon Fukayuki and DJ Lala, of the drag show. And it was also very active during the AIDS and the AIDS and HIV epidemic, in particular in the 1990s. Furthermore, we're not in Tokyo anymore, and even though a lot of studies on deviating sexualities and gender identities are focused on Tokyo, this helps us to get a more marginal perspective, even though while still staying central. It also makes it possible to see if there is a counter-Tokyo sensibility, as Pendleton argues. And the case of Club Metro is particularly interesting because the performers go beyond female impersonation. The drag queens of Club Metro do not just try to look like a woman, but they try to overcome that. They're interested in the grotesque, in the deformed, in creating a drag that is unsettling of stable identities, of the sacred and of beauty. And all this, I plan to do it by adopting a between method triangulation strategy, which consists in the combination of different methodological approaches that allows us to transcend the limitations of each approach and to look at a phenomenon from multiple perspectives. Specifically, I intend to employ ethnography and a biographical approach, and other ones if the research period here makes me realize that there's need for more. For the ethnographic part, of course, I do participate observation at the show by paying attention not only at the performances, but also at the audience, thus allowing me to see the tensions and the connections that create both between the performers and the audience and within the audience itself. If allowed, I will follow in the following month the artists behind the stage so as to witness the transformation from non-drag to drag. And this will allow me to see how things and products, both just makeup or cultural products such as a dress, are embedded in the queer and transcultural webs and entanglements. And this whole approach allows me to see knowledge as located and to value proximity and horizontalities as the epistemological points of departure, instead of adopting a more theoretical or top-down approach. For the biographical part, I see the value of life histories in that they uncover what's left unwritten, and they allow us to possibly see emotions and feelings that arise during the life review as analytically powerful. and an oral history indeed is not just a way to retrieve information. I mean, that there's books for that, but it's also a way to it's also a way to see the process of life review in the process, and gives us insights about the subjectivity of the interviewee and their memory reconstruction process. I will adopt semi-structured interviews, trying to minimize my presence, of course, but by basing myself on the idea of reflexive interview developed by Denzin, I see that I have to be aware that my presence is there, that I'm there and I'm modifying the field. And that the interview itself is not an aseptic test, but it's a performance. It takes meaning is created and performed within it, and the interview is create and embody cultural meanings. And to go back to analyzing the words of the theoretical basis of my project, it's time to see what gender is, because we find gender everywhere, gender, genere in Italian, but what is it? If we look at Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one sex. If we look at Macmillan instead, it's the roles, behaviors, activities, and characteristics that a particular society considers appropriate for men and women. And while these definitions are satisfying in that they see gender as different from sex and as social and cultural construct, they still rely on binary definitions, and there are uneasy associations with sex. And that's why we turn to Scott, and that says gender as an historical lens of analysis, one that intersectionally interlocks with factors such as race, class, or origin. And it's also a considered element of social relationship based on perceived difference between the sexes and a primary way of signifying powers. Of course, given that we're talking about drag, we cannot talk about Butler, which is the theoretical core of my research. For Butler, gender is performative. It's always a doing. It's a series of acts that congeal over time and give the appearance, the idea of a substance that, however, does not exist a priori. Gender is then not innate, but it's a social and cultural construct. And however, Butler's ideas have been contested for being too top-down, too society imposes gender on people. And that's where I see Greco's experience in drag king workshops particularly interesting, in that witnessing how the drag persona and the identities and gender categories are created in workshops communally and collectively by the participants. My theory is that we can also draw parallelisms, and that we create our own identities communally and by interacting with other people. And this gives us back the agency that Butler seemingly takes away from us. So just to summarize fast, my work in the vision so far is gender has to be taken both as an analytical category and as a lived reality for many people, for many individuals. It is performative and socially and culturally constructed, but however has to be understood as something that is communally created. And that, again, brings us back to the topic of agency. The other word that is really famous is that of drag queen, really popular, but what is a drag queen? In the popular understanding, a drag queen is a man, a gay man, who performs and dresses as a woman. However, the reality is more complex. There are heterosexual queens, there are transsexual queens, transgender queens, there are assigned female birth queens, and then there is no direct correlation between gender or sex and drag. Rather, it's better to just focus on the feature, on the performance, and based on the performance aspects, what a drag queen is. In Japan, the discussion becomes even more complicated because there are several identities and terms that are related to drag. Just to quote a few, New Hafu, Danso, Joso, Otokonoko, and the most celebrated ones, the most mainstream ones, that are the Onnagata and the Takarazuka Sotokoyaku. I, however, believe that drag is different from all of these identities. First of all, because it has different geographical and temporal origins. We're talking of a phenomenon that arose in the 19th century, more or less in the Euro-American sphere. It has different cultural references and different aims and activities, and the most important aspect is that it entails a different identification. drug is understood as a way of performing rather than a way of being, as instead, for example, the Tokonoko phenomenon can also be read as a way of identifying and being, and not just performing. And okay, let's go fast. So to just go back to the two that seems closer to drag and that are most celebrated, the Onnagata Kabuki. The Onnagata is similar to a drag queen in that they perform an idealized type of femininity that is unattainable in real life. The woman that the Onnagata performs, as well as the woman that the drag queen performs, does not exist. They are performing ideals, models, and putting them all together in one single figure. However, this direct correlation is pretty much what there is, at least from what I understood until now. There are different cultural and origins and differences. We already talked about it, and when we talk about kabuki, it's a very old and very established type of performing art, of which drag is not an evolution. And currently it's different social statuses. They have different social statuses. When we talk of kabuki, we're talking of something very official, very mainstream, while drag is still a very subcultural phenomenon, in particular in Japan. And drag performance might be inspired by kabuki, but as some of them reveal in their interviews, this is not a given. There's no direct correlation between the two. What I think is closer to drag, to Metro's drag, is the Takarazuka Otokoyaku. The Tokoyaku is a female actress specializing in male roles, and that performs models of masculinity that are targeted and created by, and particularly liked by, the women that go to the Takarazuka Review to watch the shows. And they are very close to the drag queen in that the Otokoyaku creates their own masculine persona by manipulating the masculine kata. So the features, the mannerisms, the behavior that males are believed to have. Just as a drag queen takes what is perceived to be a woman and twists it and adapts it to create their own persona. There is also a direct correlation made clear by Furuhashi Teiji in particular in an interview between Club Metro's drag and Takarazuka. The difference is in the money that they have, and the fashion, from what I could see at the show, seems very much inspired by Takarazuka. Just to conclude and to give you an idea of what exactly is the show, I will briefly move to the preliminary observation that I could gather during my last visit to the club on September 29th, 2023. So that's a typo there. And sorry. And yeah, so the show, we have the entire night is divided in two shows that last approximately 2 hours, 30 minutes each. Each show is announced by Diamonds Are Forever, the song by Shirley Bassey, and between and after the show, people dance with the Queens and with Go-Go Boys. The songs that were played, out of the 13 songs played, only 2 were Japanese, while the rest were mostly English, but I was surprised to find 2 Italian songs, which brought me back. And what I could see from that is that humor and camp play a major role in the performances. Camp is in the outfit. Just to give you an idea, at some point a drag queen came out with a huge circular hanging rack with panties falling down, which threw the audience into laughter. And the scamp is also in the exaggerated makeup, but it's not just a visual device. It's also a way to understand each other and to decode the performance. 70% of the club was made up of foreigners, but I'm sure that all of us got what the performances were about, mostly because of this scamp delivery and this scamp visual. There was also a sense of community and belonging that was created within the club. For the duration of the show and the club, the identities were blurred, and the distance between the stage and the audience was blurred as well. This was also made possible by the performances that created a past and a present for all of us to enjoy during the show. And yeah, and the different fashion styles that I already mentioned, we could see Takarazuka fashion, traditional drag makeup, and apostolic manga style. Is some of the sources that I used, and thank you very much for your attention.
Marco-san, thank you very much. 非常に複数の角度からこのドラッグについてお話しされました。私は35年間京都に住んでますが、このドラッグクラブがあると知りませんでした。 ですね、マルコさんのコメントは、京都女子大学の加本逸子先生がされます。専門は社会学。その中でも国際結婚を通じて、その日本の近現代社会を社会学的に研究されています。加本先生、お願いします。
Thank you, Crane Sensei and Malcolm. Diamonds in the Subway. What a fabulous title. I love that. However, I had completely misunderstood your subtitle in Japanese way. Drug or drag problem. At a glance, diamonds are expensive as much as certain drug, cannabis, marijuana. The presentation might be about drug dealers and buyers in the subway. How Hayatochi person I am. Drugstore is much more popular than drag. Shall I ask you, audience, have you ever been to see a performance drag show? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wow. I never thought that much. The origin of the word drag is said to stand for a sort of dressed as a girl. And it's from Renaissance Europe when male actors played female roles as women were not allowed to perform on stage. Shakespeare's plays were entirely played by male actors. The traditional type can be seen here in Japan as well, like you said, kabuki. But explain that you explained kabuki, the one being main culture, the other subculture. What are definitions of two types? What is the significance, the difference to your study? In modern sense, drag is a type of performance art. Throughout your presentation, you discuss drag and gender as two were intrinsically linked. You state your aims of study as proving that gender in contemporary Japan is a result of transcultural interaction occurring at 3 levels at least, etc. Oh my gosh. Thank you. どこまで行ったっけ? Okay, or gender being primarily a social concept, there are reasons, thank you, or they are unique to Japan. The term gender is used to cover a broad subject in everyday language. You need to specify precisely what is your research is looking at. You also need to present the base on which you link drag performance and gender issues. In the section of Why Club Metro, you mentioned the collective dump type. I wonder how many members of the audience know the word dump type. Well, you mentioned that. More than 20 years ago, once I went to Club Metro where people were dancing, drinking, hunting, or, loud DJ music, but no drag queen performance on that day. So I did not know that the title of drag queen shows has been Diamonds Are Forever. Why they take Diamonds Forever since 1990s? Well, go back to dump type. You mentioned Furuhashi Teiji, who was born 1960s in Kyoto and got a master's degree from Kyoto City University of Art. Then the students of the same university created artist group of multimedia performance in 1984. No doubt it was easy for him to find experts or eggs, play, dance, film, art, music, design, architecture, etc. So now I understand why Club Metro. Interrelation between Kyoto City University of Arts and some type of drag queens performances. I really wish Mitsuhashi Junko-san is here today. Her sex or passport or koseki must be still male. But I'm not sure though. She told me that he has a family and used to do a salaryman, businessman in the daytime. As a transvestite, Junko-san enjoyed cross-dressing only after 5. I met her at the study group of Inoue Shoichi sensei, the director of Nichibunken here. By that time, she became a full-time cross-dresser, often wears the kimono and mercaps on. And is she a drag? Her most recent book, 歴史の中の多様な性、日本とアジア、変幻するsexuality from Iwanami to 2022, could be translated as multifaceted sexuality in history, ever-changing sexuality in Japan and Asia. Making comparison between East Asian drag culture sounds more interesting to me. Here is an article from AFP written by Laura Chen. At Beijing, the first large-scale voguing dance party was held in March 27 in 2021. An organizer of this party, Dazi, has dance studio and have lessons for voguing in the capitals of China. Voguing dance is popular among drag people. My favorite drag is Mikey-san of Tokyo Gegege. Or whose voguing is brilliant, you must say that. He's him. Astonishing fact is, in the period of suffering from coronaviruses, Chinese people enjoy voguing dance party. Is there any Chinese version of Diamonds Forever kind of a stage? Or any differences between Japanese Chinese drags? Is there no dumb type of performances in China? Or diamonds, not only crystal clear, but multifaceted? If you shed light on properly, you could have observed the colors of each diamond. As Cyndi Lauper sings, I hope your or their true colors, or fake colors. Parallelisms, you're in your questions and hypothesis. Why parallelisms? It's hard to pronounce. Anyway, but parallelisms is far from multifaceted diamonds, aren't they? All diamonds, not only in the subway in Kyoto, but any metro in the world, will reach your thesis. 頑張ってください. Thank you.
Kamoto Sensei, thank you very much for your inspiring speech. So this wraps up our second session. Please give another applause to our presentators and commentators. And so we go to the last part. 最後のこの前半の最後のセッションに行きたいと思います。各節にさんと荒木先生お願いします。じゃあ早速入りたいと思います。5番目の発表者は各節にさんです。そして担当者は金子さんです。金子さんお願いします。
はい、本日2回目の紹介をさせていただきます国際交流基金の金子です。続いての登壇者であるゴー・シュエニー先生についてご紹介をさせていただきます。ゴー先生は中国専制師範大学に教授として勤められており、現在立命館大学にて訪日研究に取り組まれています。今回は小物と室町時代の漢文学の教育、桃源瑞泉式章を例としてという題でご報告されます。小物とは、中世から近世の日本で作成された中国の古典籍に対する解説書のようなものであります。特に室町時代には五山の僧侶を担い手として大量に作成され、郷先生は現在その大量に残されている小物の解読を進められていらっしゃいます。先生曰く、そうした小物を読んでいるとしばしば深く感動することがあるそうです。当時の僧侶たちは応仁の乱で荒廃した京都を離れ、地方へ散り散りになり、中には山奥で極めて貧しい生活を送る方々もいらっしゃいました。 そうした中でも彼らは知恵の探求心を捨てず、懸命に勉学に励んでいました。小物を読むことで、伝わってくる彼らの切実な思いに対して涙を禁じ得ない。そして、自分ももっと頑張らなければと思わせてくれるのだそうです。郷先生のご報告は、このような小物が持つ物語に皆様を誘ってくれることと思います。ちなみに郷先生、アメリカのドナルド・キーン先生の大ファンだそうでして、キーン先生の著作を愛読していて、その分析の深さや鋭さにいつも感動していらっしゃるそうです。そしていつかご自身もアメリカで訪問研究をしてみたいとおっしゃっていました。もしこの場にアメリカの日本文化研究にお詳しい先生がいらっしゃいましたら、ぜひ郷先生にお声掛けいただくとともに、場合によってはリクルートしていただけますと大変幸いです。それではどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
ご紹介いただきありがとうございます。新生師範大学の郭節義です。現在は立命館大学で滞在研究を行っております。近年私は日本中世の小物と呼ばれる資料を用いて和漢比較文学の研究に取り組んでおります。今回の報告では室町時代の前祖桃源瑞泉が表した小物のうち、特に四季書を例としてその中における中国文学資料の利用方法及び漢文学の教育思想についてお話ししたいと思います。ではまず小物について少しご説明させていただきます。中世の日本では朝廷や寺院、足利顔などで漢石の注釈や講義が盛んに行われました。そしてそこで講義の際に使用された漢石の教科書は現代の国語学者により小物と呼ばれています。柳田誠二氏の定義によれば、小物とは主に室町時代に前宗や博士学者が記した漢石、仏書、国書の講義記録や注釈書を指します。日本における小物の研究は明治末期より始まり、戦後には国語学者たちによる小物の調査と出版が盛んになりました。したがって、小物の研究は主に国語学の分野で行われてきました。一方、近年中国で域外漢石研究などの新しい研究分野が現れるの中で、絵画で保存された中国古典に関連する貴重な研究資料として小物が注目を集めました。ただ、中国の学会ではあくまで漢文で書かれた小物を中心で研究を進められています。今日の報告では主に中国文学小物、つまり中国文学資料に関連する講義や注釈のことですが、これを利用して室町時代の知識人が中国古典文学をどのように学習し解釈したのかについて考えたいと思います。現在日本に現存する小物の多くは京都聖国寺の前宗桃源瑞泉によって書かれたものです。一般的には、桃源瑞泉が小物を制作するきっかけとなったのは恩義の乱であると言われます。恩林元年、戦争が聖国寺にも及んだため、桃源瑞泉はふるさとの近江に戻りました。その後、およそ20年の間、彼はここで四季や外場の詩などを弟子たちに講義し、小物を執筆が続きました。内藤江南は、都度に、恩義の乱が日本史の大きな分岐点であったと指摘しましたが、この時期、漢学の教育が郷土から地方社会にも広がることになりました。小物の四季書は文明7年から文明9年までの間、断続的に作成されました。また、小物という名前ではありますが、司馬遷の四季の前編に注釈したわけではありません。この表の示した通り、四季書の中の表、書及び成果の大部分に対しては注釈しておりません。四季書の半分は主に7種があります。このうち本国語では主に教田文を利用しております。 四憲章における中国の文学資料の引用は、主にこの3種類があります。桃源は式を講義する際に、詩書や遺書、小史学の文献を参照したことは従来からよく知られております。ただ、実際にはこれら以外にも中国の詩文が大量に引用されております。ですが、このことについては既存の研究では分析されることはほとんどありません。今日、四憲章の中で、中国の文学の記事が数多くが検出されます。そして、この記事に中国の文学のジャンルによって、詩文、詩話、小説、この3つに分類することができます。では、まず、詩分類について見てまいります。四憲章に引用されている詩文は、唐宋時代の詩人の作品が中心となります。そのうち、最も多いのは、外葉の詩です。その理由は、桃源瑞泉は、四憲章を制作していた時期に外葉の詩を講義していたことを関係があると思います。また、四憲章における引用の景色から見れば、外葉の作品は全文から引用されることが多く、また外葉の詩集から引用されていることがわかります。一方で、その他の詩人の作品については、主に詩話の作品からの引用であって、個人の文集からの引用ではないと考えられます。次に詩話を見てまいります。四憲章には宋代の詩話が多く引用されています。そのうち特に詩林講義が最も中止された詩話です。例を挙げますと、資料1の項羽本義では詩林講義を引用し、項羽の失敗について議論しています。では、桃源はなぜこの詩林講義を特に重視していたのでしょうか。その理由について、詩林講義が朱子学の影響を強く受けた詩話であったことと関係があると思われます。最後、この小説の例です。桃源は四季、感情が怪異のことを記載しないため、四憲章では大量の伝記や小説を引用することは表明しています。小説は一般的に全体の文章が長いため、桃源は引用する際、内容を加筆するなどして、小物の面白さを高め、聴講者の興味を引き出せるよう、様々空腹をしています。例えば、この資料2は、白太鼓という女性についての注釈ですが、桃源は終身講義という小説を引用しています。桃源はこうした小説を引用する中で、仏教的な解釈も多く取り入れていることから、仏教の影響を見ることができます。そして、ここまで四憲章に引用される中国文学資料のジャンルと特徴について見てまいりました。次に検討したいのは、桃源がこれらの文学資料を引用した目的及び五山前理における中国文学の教育方法についてです。そこで、以下では、四憲章における注釈の役割を手がかりとして、これらの問題について探っていきたいと思います。四憲章の中の文学注釈の役割は主に訓項、名物、風俗、伝項の4つに分類できます。まず、この文字と単語の訓項です。桃源は四憲章の中の異体字、多義語、通過字などを注釈する際、聴講者の理解の便宜のために関連する詩文を頻繁に引用しています。例えば、資料3はこの、新詩法本義の10月、この10月に対する注釈です。桃源はこの週、すなわち単であり、就活が単活とも読めることを説明するために、徒歩の詩を引用しました。このような講義資料は、漢詩の作成において言葉の使い方を理解するための重要な参考資料となると思われます。 次は名物の交渉です。例えば、資料4は、大英列伝のブドウ酒に対するの注釈です。桃源はブドウを注釈した後、外場の詩句を引用して、モーダという人物がただ一頭のブドウ酒を申請して、領主の官僚になった物語を説明しながら、ブドウ酒の貴重さを強調しています。そして、詩経には、中国の各地の風俗や制度に関する記録がたくさんあります。これらの説明のために、桃源は詩文を引用して解釈する事例が多く見られます。例えば、資料5。この資料5の内容は、税制に対するこの注釈です。式書ではまずこの税制の意味、つまり入り向こう、この意味を詳しく説明し、続いて日本の風俗との対比を行い、最後に皇山国の詩を引用しています。日常的に残国の詩に親しんでいた五山前奏によっては、税制の意味は三国の関連する詩を見るだけですぐに理解できたと考えられます。最後のこの式書の注釈には式に関連した永遠詩からの引用も多く見られます。資料の6の引用、この外場の詩全文を利用して、この暗記性のことを詳しく説明しています。これらの講義資料は、主に漢詩を作る際に詩集の中の人物、地名、事件などを利用する方法を学ぶことを目的としています。最後、この桃源随声の方法についてちょっと説明したいと思います。桃源は、式を講義する際には中国文学資料を重視していたことが分かりました。では、彼はなぜそんなに中国文学資料を重視したのでしょうか。全体的に見て、桃源は式書の知識のよりところは3種類があると思います。それはまず中国の式注釈文、次は日本の平安時代以来の式の訓典文、および五山前奏の式、感情の講義です。この3種類について、桃源はそれぞれの彼の注釈の方法は次のようなものです。第一に日本の例を例記をすることで日本の読者に漢文を理解させようと試みました。第二に宋学の影響を受けたことから五山前林の訓典を用いた式を解釈しました。第三に大量の文学資料を利用することで自身の講義の特徴を作り出しています。つまり彼の漢文学の教育思想は文学と史学の総合この包含的な役割を重視していた思想が見られます。おそらく彼の意図は中国の経史に関する教養は詩文創作の基準であることを強調することにあったのだと思います。最後、本日の報告では主に桃源の式書を例として注釈における彼の中国文学資料の利用と詩詞考証とも呼ばれる文学観について考えいたしました。もう今報告での考察結果を踏まえて、今後は式書以外の中国文学書物を分析対象として室町時代の知識人たちによる中国文学研究の様子を明らかにしていきたいと考えております。報告は以上でございます。ご清聴いただきありがとうございました。
郭先生、京都の聖国寺の学問僧、桃源随泉の、漢石の注釈、そして、中国の文学書の利用についてのご発表ありがとうございました。コメンテーターは日文研の荒木博教授です。日本文学のご専門ですが、特に源氏物語とか今昔物語、つれづれ草などの古典の 研究を行っていますが、非常に多様性に富んで、前はシェイクスピアとの比較とか、あるいは夢の文化についてもいろいろ書いていらっしゃいます。それでは荒木先生お願いします。
はい、どうもクレイ先生ありがとうございました。それから賀来先生、非常に面白いご発表、非常に刺激になりました。幅広さは先生は長安、昔でいう長安、西安に住んでいらっしゃいますので、まさに京都の中国の原点でいつも歴史を見ながら研究をされている。ですからその長安と都市空間と文学の研究などのご著書もある非常に幅広い先生なんですが、ドナルド・キーンという名前が出てくるとは思いませんでした。先日っていうか今年でしたか、横浜でドナルド・キーン展、去年ですかね、キーン展が行われて、日文献にもおなじみの先生方がドナルド・キーンの思い出を語る、日文献にもドット先生っていう、ロンドン大学の先生が来て、ちょっとそのインタビューについて聞いたりしました。ぜひドナルド・キーンセンターのあるアメリカのニューヨークのコロンビア大学で、じっくり春尾白根先生なんか鈴木富先生などおられますので、ぜひ勉強していただきたいと思いますが、今日のお話はまさにその中国語で書かれたものを中心とする小物という、これは私80年代に国語学とか国文学と呼ばれるいわゆる日本の語学や文学を研究した人間からすると非常に衝撃で、この小物っていうのはどちらかというと日本の話し言葉をたどる、つまり中国語を日本人が日本語でさっきちょっと出てきましたが、なんとかじゃとかなんとかだぞという言い方で説明をする口語資料として、用いられていました。それで我々は小物の小が大事なんだと繰り返し教えられて、小っていうのは書くライティング、それから抜き出すピックアップ、そして注釈をするアノテーション、この3つを持っている言葉で、それがこの小物というものの原点で非常に幅広い世界なんだと、習ったんですが、その幅広さは今日の各先生の資料にもありますように、ちょっと本の書影がありましたが、膨大な分量で、しかもその我々はどちらかというとカタカナで書かれた日本語の方を読んで、日本語当時の中世の言葉を抜き出したりしてきたんですけども、この各先生の今回のご研究はまさに正面切って小物総体をどう捉えるか、当時の最高の学識のあった前奏が史記というですね、中国の一大古典を、歴史の古典をどう読んだかということを日本の側の研究者も巻き込み、そして中国の生きがい漢石的な要素も盛り込みながら、日本で読まれた史記というものを相対的に読んでいく非常にスケールの大きいご研究です。ただその難しいんですね。カタカナだけ読むだけでも大変なのに、その膨大なものの中から史記を、世界を理解した上で正しくそこがどう中国語で訳され、あるいはどう日本語で捉えられているのかをできる人っていうのはそうたくさんいないので、各先生も自身でも非常にたくさんの研究をされていますが、ネットワーキングにも非常に熱心で、ちょっと耳にした噂では一昨日は早稲田大学の読書会に出ていたということで、少し前は早稲田で1年間研究をされてますし、今は京都の立命館でなさってますので、まさに東西横断的な、東にも大事な禅寺が鎌倉にあります。それを学びながら研究をされている。今日も特に最後にまとめられた小物の研究の特質ですね。当時の前奏が日本国内の類似例を当てはめて何とか説明をしようと広げていたということ、それから古代学ではなくて総学というですね、少し新しい、今日から見れば古いんですけれども、総学を使って、総学と全然違う解釈をする場合がありますので、そういうものを使って同じコンフューションでも全く違う観点を相対化して捉えていくということで、もう一つはこれがなかなか国語学者にも漢文学者にも難しいんですけれども、文学資料を利用しているってことを今追って、分析を続けていらっしゃる。これは読み方も大変ですし、出典の探索も大変なんですが、この指揮章についてこの研究をぜひまとめていただければ、非常に大きな日中双国、あるいは和漢比較文学という言い方もあるんですが、それへの貢献になると思います。もう一つ私が非常に興味を持ったのは応仁の乱との関係でして、応仁の乱はいろんなものを分断するわけですね。例えば京都で有名な葵祭というのが長らく分断されたのは応仁の乱が起こったからで、しかし一方で京都大学の隣にある吉田神社っていうのがありますが、吉田神道を再興した吉田兼友っていう人が、この応仁の乱の恐怖から自分の宗教をもう一度見直して吉田神道というのを確立していく。で、彼が日本書紀の注釈をやっぱり小物で講義をしていて、講義なのでいろんな人が来る。そこには禅僧も入っていたと言われていて、最近その この小物の講義の場における禅宗や神道とのまさにネットワーキングが若手の研究者の間でも話題になっていますので、ぜひ今日お話したような内容を日本の学会でもですね、もう繰り返し、なかなか皆さん分かってくれないところもありますので、繰り返しいろんな学会でご発表いただければ、そしてまたこの後のネットワーキングでもいろんな分野と交流をしていただければと思います。私からは以上です。
荒木先生、小物の背景と、研究状況についての説明ありがとうございました。それではもう一回、一人だけですが、アプラウスというか握手をお願いします。